The revenue recognition standard came out in May, and one of the things it does, it affords companies choices of transition alternatives. Can you describe or help me understand what might be some things a company would think about as they're thinking through those alternatives?
So companies have been given two options on how they transition to the standard. The first one is what they call a full retrospective approach. So basically what will happen is you look back all the way for all periods presented and apply this guidance as if it was the only guidance that existed during those periods. So if you take that choice, though, you're going to need to start capturing data related to the new standard as early as January 1, 2015 if you're a calendar year company. The other option is the modified prospective approach, rather. So what they've said with the modified prospective approach is you can continue to show your prior years using the old GAAP, but only show the new GAAP for the current year. Now, if you do that, that does mess up the trend information, so they said you have to add some additional disclosures. So the disclosures that you need to add are basically to look through and find each of the line items that would have been different had you continued on using the old GAAP, and then disclose what those line items are and the amount of the difference. So there's still some additional work that has to be done, even if you choose the modified prospective approach.
So to summarize that, if I chose the full retro approach, I'm going to report under old GAAP, but then I'm also going to have to report under new GAAP, and we'll call it doubling up for fiscal 15 and fiscal 16. So I have to do what I call dual reporting for a couple of years. And if I follow the modified approach, although it affords me probably more time, at least you'd think so, right? Once you transition, you also have to effectively dual report because you have to report on the disclosure changes that would be impacted from old GAAP to new GAAP in the period right after adoption. So either way, it appears to me a company's going to have to deal with dual reporting one way or the other.
And to your point about time, it's an interesting point. You do have to be capturing stuff earlier if you do the full retrospective approach in terms of the dual capture. But you do also have a little bit more luxury there to make sure that everything is in place at the right time when transition comes. The downside, if you will, with taking the modified prospective approach is that if you don't have everything in place and ready, you only have your first quarter to get that reporting right, because you have to make those disclosures in your first quarter reporting. So companies might find themselves stretched a bit thin if they are already have a lot of challenges getting their quarterly reporting done, trying to do this dual capture of information and get this additional information while making sure that they're applying the new standard appropriately in that first period. Yeah. So there's some pros and cons to each.
In your experience, you've been out in the market, you've been talking to companies. Is there a preference from one to the other, or if there is a preference, any trends on the preference that you're finding?
Well, it depends a lot on the industries, and it also depends on what peers within industries are doing. So kind of what we're seeing is for industries that are more heavily affected, we're seeing more of a tendency to go toward the full retrospective because it does provide better trend information. There's a lot of thinking that even if a company chose to do the modified prospective, if there's significant change, they might be asked by their analysts to show what the prior years would have looked like anyway, so it's easier just to start there. But for other companies that expect to see less change, we're seeing a bit more tendency to just take the modified prospective approach.
So that's interesting. So you mentioned more affected versus less affected companies. So if you thought about industry sectors, and which ones would you think about as being more affected, for example, by the change?
Whether you believe you're significantly affected or not, there's two elements of that. First, it doesn't matter if you're significantly affected. If you're affected, you need to make sure you get it right. There's not a lot of leeway in getting revenue wrong because if you're 2% off on your revenue line, then that drops to the bottom, and then that's a lot more significant difference when you're looking at the net income line. You're going to have to walk through this model step by step, evaluating each of those steps, documenting as you go, so that you can you're able to validate that in fact the changes are what they are. They're no more significant, no less significant, but that validation process has to take place. So even if you expect that you'll end up close to where you started, the process to get there, you're going to have to walk through it, and that includes things like rewriting your accounting policies. Because companies need to look not only at the business they're doing today and the contracts they have in place today, but they need to put in place a sustainable process where all the new business and new contracts, people are looking at those through the proper lens. So it's going to be really important to get that, the procedural parts and the controls around that right as we go through this transition phase.
Yeah, my experience is very similar to that, the process change aspects to this, which include operations and systems and everything else, are quite significant, even if you're not impacted a large amount by the accounting change.
All industries are affected to some extent, so it's really just a question of how much change do you have, how are you evaluating that change and getting that new process in place that you're going to need, because even a small change is a big change when you're